Hey City Collective, thank you for joining us online right now. We are about to jump into a conversation with two individuals that I get the privilege of having this conversation with, and I get to call friends. Uh, they represent and they're part of RZIM Canada. Alonzo and Daniel, you're going to get to know a little bit about them before we jump into things, but it's just a privilege for us as a church to have these two voices share with us about some of their story and their thoughts around the difficult questions that we sometimes face in life, and especially in the season of COVID-19 and this pandemic that we're facing. There are so many things bouncing around, so I think this is going to be a really valuable conversation. I hope you lean in with us wherever that you are. I'm excited, so I hope you're excited with me. Alonzo, could you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your story?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Alonzo Paul. My friends call me Zoe, so you're welcome to call me Zoe as well. Um, yeah. So, you know what? First of all, Jason, thank you so much for having Daniel and I on here in the first place. It's such an honor and a privilege to be a part of what you guys are doing in BC, and it's an honor and privilege as well to have this time with two of some of my best friends. Um, Daniel and I got well acquainted here in Toronto, where we are. But Jason and I, man, we go old school. We go way back to youth ministry time at Calgary Life Church,
For
Project
real.
314, throwback, hashtag.
Yeah.
And and that's really where I got started in ministry. So I didn't grow
Mm.
up in a Christian home. It was like casually Catholic at best. It was more fire insurance than anything. And it was at Calgary Life Church
Mm.
that I really encountered the risen Christ. So
Mhm.
I came from a background of drugs and really self-destructive habits to a radical encounter with Jesus that just transformed
Wow.
my life. And
Wow.
that's where I got to know Jason. And
Yeah, man.
Jason was part of the same youth group, and we got to reach out to young people, and we've
Hmm.
seen it just explode
Yeah.
from 80 people to 120 people. I think it's now 150, maybe
They're
180,
crushing it.
something
They're
like
crushing
that.
it.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
doing amazing things. You know what I mean? And that's where Jason and I think, really cut our teeth on public speaking and
Hmm.
explaining the
Hmm.
Bible and telling people about Jesus. So that's really where we started. And then I went from there, went to Oxford to study at Oxford University, this little second-rate institution. Perhaps you've heard of it. And I'm just playing. And and that's where I studied theology and got to think
Yeah.
about some of these really big topics, which are so fascinating. So for me, and this will be my last thing here, is me coming to Christ was not the
Mm.
intellectual pursuit and then finding Jesus. It was
Mm.
other way around. It was this existential crisis that I was in. I just needed a lifeline, and
Hmm.
Jesus was that one that was so beautiful, and throughout that lifeline to somebody that, someone like me. I'm still just in awe of God's love. And so that was my beginning. And then afterwards, I wanted to say, okay, I feel like this is real. Now I need to study and see if it's actually credible. Like, is
Hmm.
it just
Hmm.
beautiful, or
Hmm.
is it a beautiful truth? And
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
where that pursuit came. And that's what's led me to RZAM. So I've been on the team
It's
for
awesome.
about 3 years now. Yeah.
So good. Daniel.
Yeah, well, it is, like Alonso said, such a joy to get to be with you guys. I just got to know Jason since the call on Monday, which is a couple days ago, and
Yeah.
for Alonso, he and I, yeah, I've never had a friend so like profoundly close as Alonso.
Hmm.
So just
Hmm.
fun to be able to spend some time. I was born into a Christian family, and I was really serious about my faith from the youngest of ages. Yeah, even from before I can remember. And then when I got to mid high school, I just had some really brilliant teachers who challenged
Hmm.
me to think
Hmm.
critically and forced me to
Wow.
ask some tough questions. And began to think, is this God that I love, is he actually real? I was
Wow.
really passionate about fighting human trafficking, and I love the Bible's teaching God's heart for justice and for rescuing
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
standing with the marginalized. But I didn't know if this God that's so beautiful is actually true. And so I started asking some really tough questions of my faith and tough questions of the Bible, wrestling through that. And that took me to university. My degrees were in history and philosophy in my undergrad, and then master's in history. And that just kind of started giving me more tools of inquiry into these tough questions.
Yeah.
Eventually, I came to the place where I remember asking myself one day, like, have I seen enough evidence to
Hmm.
believe that this is actually true, that God is really the God of the Christian Bible? And then I thought, you know what? I actually think it's going to take more faith to say this isn't true. Like, there's so much overwhelming evidence that this is legit. So if I want to be intellectually honest, I got to fall through with this Christian conviction. So continued on in my faith. And now, after spending the past 12 years at Parliament Hill, where I got to be involved in work fighting human trafficking, I now find myself working alongside Alanzo with RZAM, where we get to be helping other people all around the world explore these tough questions of life's meaning and purpose and God and all that kind of stuff.
Amazing. I know you both used the word beautiful when you were talking about your story, a beautiful truth. And you both have this book behind you. I don't know if we can see it in Alonzo's right now, but this book behind you, it says beautiful. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Sure. I'd love to share the story behind it. So there is an organization, it's part of RZAM. It's called Wellspring International. It's our humanitarian arm. And so they partnered up with a group of Christians out in India that were working to restore these women who were the victims of bridal burning. Now, this is really fascinating, actually. There's 8,000 of these cases roughly per year that happen, that they are aware of at the very least. And what this organization did was sought to come in to minister to these women, to help restore them, and not just internally by sharing the hope that's found in the gospel, though that's very important, but also to restore them on the exterior. So they're involved in a lot of reconstructive surgery to these beautiful ladies. And really the reason why I think that they called it beautiful was the beauty that's in human beings, according to the Christian worldview, is deeper than this superficial sort of Western idea of beauty. Now, here's what's really interesting. The artist that does a lot of the painting. So at our office and at RZAM down in Atlanta, there's a big art exhibit of a gentleman who had painted some of the ladies that had some work done and got involved in the ministry. Now, here's what's really cool. So as the painter is painting these amazing and brave women, he puts a layer of gold underneath the paint, so on top of the canvas. And this is what he was trying to communicate, is that even though the exterior of these women were savaged by some of these men and families, and sometimes from other women, that even though the exterior is damaged, that because of God and because of what Jesus Christ has done on the cross, that these women have this internal, intrinsic value and dignity. And so if there's like little spots in the painting where the painting is flaking off, you see the gold that's on the inside. And in fact, as it gets tarnished on the exterior, you see more of the gold shining through. And it's just this beautiful piece of art that just shows this is exactly how God sees you.
It is stunning. I love it. I was reading up on what the artist was saying about it, and they were saying often when charities feature people who've been the victims of violence, it's often done to evoke sympathy. But what's different about this book is that these paintings are beautiful. Like what you notice, they all is featuring women with these really painful burns, but it's done in such a beautiful way, highlighting their beauty and not trying to just evoke sympathy so that you donate more to the charity. And for me, actually, this comes right back to what we're talking about with our stories of how we ended up where we are today. Is that I was flirting pretty hard with atheism when I was doing my studies in philosophy at the University of Ottawa. At the same time, I was doing work on fighting human trafficking and fighting for human dignity. And I came across some of the most famous philosophers in the world. Kai Nelson, who's a globally famous Canadian professor of philosophy, and Richard Dawkins, even more famous from Oxford, where Alanzo hails from. These guys in their writing, as they write about their atheistic perspective of the world, say, hey, you know what? There's nothing intrinsically valuable about a human being. In a sense, I'd summarize so much of what these guys are saying, and they didn't say this, but this is what I distill it down to: that there's no real difference between being crushed and a leaf being trampled. It's just matter. And the sense of grief we feel when another human being is hurt is a subjective truth. And I think that really stood out to me about some of the stuff is that sounds all fine and good when we're in a university classroom setting and we're talking about enough that's just subjective value. You know, I feel human beings of value. Can't we leave it at that? But it's precisely like if you listen to the story of these women, if you listen to the story of any victim, maybe even your own story, you can see that it's precisely when life has like punched in the face. So in this case, really scar them so horrifically, where one feels like trash, or it's not subjectively true. You know what I'm saying? Like it's when to know whether or not life has value and life has we have human dignity is when we don't feel like it does, either for ourselves or others. And so I just found that atheism was so empty when it came to answering that tough question.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And so this is more than just like a really well-placed marketing ploy in behind you. It's actually like a really amazing book. So thank you for sharing on that. That's amazing. I love both of those like perspectives that you guys brought. You were talking about the intrinsic value that we believe within the Christian worldview that we carry. And right now in this like crisis, there is this kind of like shared traumatic experience that everyone is having. Kind of like what you were saying, Daniel, that when you're in a classroom and you're talking about these ideas, sure, they can be accepted, but when you're kind of tossed in the reality of life, and in this moment where we kind of find ourselves today of this shared traumatic experience, I think people are asking the question, and you brought up like a great statistic that your team was talking about. People are asking the question, where is God in this? How do I find hope in this? And what do I do to actually thrive in the season or experience the fullness of this traumatic moment and not have it overwhelm me? When we have this conversation about like hope and God, what would you guys say is some of the things that have encouraged you in your own experience of this COVID crisis in terms of finding God and hope in it?
Yeah. Daniel, do you want to start or do you want me to?
Talking about beautiful last hope for Alanzo.
Yeah, sure. This has been an interesting experience. Obviously, for all of us, this is an unprecedented experience as well. We don't really have any sort of way of comparing it to some other previous experience that we may have had. So I think that as I've been observing what's been going on, I think I start reflecting more on the person of Christ in the midst of suffering. And so I think this is really what Daniel was getting at as well when it comes to some of the bankruptcy within atheism. Richard Dawkins famously writes, you know, atheism, for some of the people that endure suffering or, you know, get contracted disease or something like that, this is simply, in an atheistic worldview, this is just simply you're unlucky.
Wow.
And that's a really bankrupt sort of way of looking at things, and I think it's rather dehumanizing to say these sorts of things, and it's ultimately not hopeful at all. Nor do I think that Richard Dawkins thinks that the atheistic worldview is hopeful. If they're honest, like Bertrand Russell, for instance, the famous 20th century philosopher, if they're an honest atheist, they're going to say, well, ultimately, no, it isn't very hopeful for our universe. Even if we survive the COVID-19 thing, it's just one thing. It's just, we're given enough time, it's eventually going to annihilate all of us. So when I'm thinking about this sort of thing, what do I think about? Well, just very simply, for me, I'm a bit of a feeler. So I'm a thinker and a feeler, but I'm probably predominantly a feeler. And anytime that I've gone through real suffering, like last year, my brother passed away from cancer. Jason, you knew Andrew. We spent lots of time together. Andrew came into the church, CLC, Calgary Life Church, and got saved when my sister invited us to there. And so when I've reflected upon like deep moments of grief or suffering and observing suffering, the thing that I think I cling on to the most is the solidarity that Christ provides, that he knows exactly what we've gone through. So let me just tell you a very quick story, and then I want to let Daniel chime in, because there's so many facets to this, you know what I mean? It's so complex. But one sort of thing that I really glean strength from is solidarity, and this is what I mean by that. So one day it's at CBC, that's our building here, where our office is in Toronto. It's in the CBC building, downtown Toronto. And one day, as we're have the art exhibit, beautiful, on display, I had a gentleman come in from an absolutely different worldview than Christianity. I won't say what it was. And his name was Naweed. Now, the name is very important to remember. His name is Naweed. And And as I'm walking around, I'm showing him all of the different pieces of artwork. He's really, really fascinated by all of these sorts of things. And we're looking at them, and then we come back down to probably my favorite piece of artwork, which is this photograph. It's not even a painting, but it's a photograph of a bunch of these survivors laughing and together. And they're all together. And he asked me, he says, Alonzo, man, like, do these women live in community together? And I'm like, wow, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure if they live in a community together, but why do you ask? And he says, I suspect that they do, because it is only those with scars that could possibly understand the scars of others. And I said to him, Naweed, the core of Christianity, unlike any other religion, at the center of it is a scarred God. Now that's profound.
Yeah.
Because we can extrapolate all sorts of profound ideas. Like if God didn't care about us, then he would not have gotten involved.
Wow.
No one was forcing God out of heaven. But he chose to get deep and entrenched into the yuck of this world and has scars just like you and me. So that sort of solidarity that I have with Christ is a tremendous sort of strength. But I don't want to monologue too long. Daniel, what do you think?
No, it's so good, Alonzo.
Love that story. That remark from him that only someone with scars can understand the scars of others. Yeah, is honestly such a remarkable insight.
Sorry, bro, I forgot to say, I said, his name is Naweed, and I made a point of highlighting that. Naweed is an Arabic name, and it's Arabic for good news.
Oh, amazing.
And I said to him, Naweed, this is the good news of Christianity, that at its core, we have this scarred God that knows exactly what we're going through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so insightful. And again, like just what Alonzo's saying about the way that we can see such community or a connection with a God who actually has scars. That idea, I can spend all day thinking about it and still not from the depth. The fact that like the apex of all power, the one who is on the one hand, you'd think that we have nothing we can relate to in him, that he is the one who isn't just the most powerful being in the universe, but he breathed the universe into existence, right? This being that is so infinite, it's fully infinite, and yet like he knows what it's like to suffer. He knows what it's like to be scarred by death. And you can entrust yourself to someone. You can trust someone who knows what it's like to be in pain. And so it matters to me. Like I flirted momentarily with atheism, but then I think probably many more Canadians and young adults are attracted less to atheism because it seems so narrow, atheism. Like I know God, and everyone who believes in a God is wrong, right? A lot of them are just like, bro, why are you so narrow-minded? But I think that just kind of a more like theistic agnosticism, like there's probably a God, I just don't know who he is. It probably draws a lot of people, but it's in those times when life is really punching you in the face that you need to know, is this actually true, or is this just sentimentality?
Yeah. We kind of talked about it in our previous conversation. We talked about the moralistic therapeutic deism and how that probably is where more people land than atheism in general. That's kind of what you're talking about, Daniel, that the idea of a morally good manner in which we live our life. Zoe, you had some like interesting thoughts around that, but the like a more pluralistic worldview leading to this idea of moralistic therapeutic deism. Could you explain it a little bit for everyone watching right now?
And Zoe, do you want to define it? I feel like they're big words that don't know everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, from my understanding of it, is that it is a way of viewing worldviews that is very inclusive. It doesn't want to say things are wrong. They just want to say that things are different and that they can be simultaneously true to some extent, some significant extent. And I think that the basic ethos of it is, if you're a good person, whatever positive afterlife there is, then you would certainly be included in that.
Right.
And that the goal or the teleology of our existence, the purpose of our existence, is to be happy, to experience some sort of deep self-actualization and realization, perhaps cultivating moral virtue, such as being humble or charitable towards others and so on, and to really just be a happy, helpful person, somebody that's not harming people. And with that, then you're pretty much well off when it comes to what happens after death, if there is something after death. So I don't want to be too hard on them. I think it comes from a good posture. Like people, I think it's a good thing that we want to be inclusive. I think it's a good thing that everybody wants to be good people, humble people. I think that people that want to be moral, that's a good thing. Lots of my atheist friends are far more moral than me. I'm not saying that you have to be a Christian in order to be a good person or anything like that. But I think that there's some serious problems as well as soon as you probe a bit deeper beyond just a surface level understanding. Because in the same way that you're saying that, we're all on the right path, and if you're just this good person and religion can just really help your subjective mental states, then you're actually, and maybe you're not aware of this, you're actually disrespecting these other worldviews, because none of them claim that, besides, some like Buddha, Baha'ism and different things like that, none of them are claiming that they're compatible with each other. So my Muslim family wouldn't say that my Hindu family is correct in their view and understanding of what God means. There'd be like significant difference, or what the afterlife means, and Christians in the same sort of sense. So I think it's a nice thing that people want to be exclusive, but at the same time, what they're maybe inadvertently or not intentionally doing is sort of not properly articulating what everyone believes.
Yeah, I feel like it's like I know in most cases, maybe every case, it comes from like a genuine nice place in someone's heart. But I feel like there's something that's like paternalistic or patronizing might be a better word. That it's like kind of patronizing and condescending, because basically it's saying like Alonzo said, anyone who identifies as Muslim and identifies as disagreeing with Hindus, and Hindus who disagree with Muslims, and like you're saying, all you 1 billion people in the world, like you think you disagree with each other, but let me tell you, you don't. I think it's like, what I'm saying? Like it kind of seems patronizing. It doesn't take them seriously, and I think that's rude at the end of the day.
Yeah, and you know what? Here's another bit just on this. I was just reading again A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis, and I encourage anybody that's going through a really rough time to check out essentially anything by Lewis, but that book in particular. It was written after his wife Joy passed away from cancer, and he was really wrestling through things. And this is what he says. He's like, when it comes down to our beliefs, our worldviews, and what we think about God and the afterlife and salvation and so on, that's all really cool until it becomes a matter of life and death. And he likens it to a rope. And he's like, you may not think much about a rope when you're just using it to tie a present. But when you're using a rope to hang off the side of a cliff, you're going to want to make sure that that rope is trustworthy. So Christianity isn't only beautiful, it's this hope that you can actually trust, and that there are really good reasons for trusting in it. And that's really what it comes down to, I think.
I love that. And I would echo what Alonzo's saying about reading that book, especially in this time that we kind of find ourselves. I think that this idea of grief is associated with very like specific life events, where in reality we experience grief in almost like daily basis. There's something that we're always grieving, something lost, something changed, something unexpected that hits us in a certain way. And I think that maybe there's varying experiences of grief, but the manner in which grief can kind of compound in our life can be really, really heavy. So even in this season, I know for Adriana and I, we had like a vacation planned, and it might seem like so trivial, but there is like an element of grief when you have something planned and then you don't get to experience it, you don't get to live into it, and you brush it off, and perhaps it is a little more trivial. You kind of say to yourself, okay, there's way worse things happening in the world right now. I shouldn't be feeling bad about this, but we do feel it. We do experience it. One of the questions that came in is, if God is good, why is COVID happening, and where do I find hope? Essentially, because everyone is grieving this season in some manner. Hey, maybe there are some people that are a little more introverted, that they at the beginning were loving it through and through, and they're like, I get all the time to myself, and this feels so good. But I would say even those who would lean into that area would probably agree that it's about time that we're feeling a little bit stir crazy. I know I'm feeling my home. I don't know about you guys, but I felt a little stir crazy this last little bit. But yeah, I want to toss that at you guys. Go ahead.
I got a 500 square foot apartment, so I feel you, bro.
Preach. Oh man. So that question, if God is good, why is COVID-19 happening? How would you guys respond to something like that?
I think even before we get into like the answer, I just want to say that from the little bit I know of God is that He so profoundly welcomes the question. In the Bible, in the middle of the Bible, there's 150 kind of song prayers. It's kind of like the prayer for the songbook of the Bible, and these we believe have been intentionally included by God to give us a language, even a vocabulary on how we can express the human experience. And one out of every 3 of those songs / prayers is lament, and specifically lament God. And in many cases, even lament about God, like expressions of anger that someone's expressing to God about God. And I find that so oddly comforting for myself. And sometimes if you listen to Christian radio, which probably you don't, but if you do, like you're not one of every songs be lament and sad and angry and brooding. And that's too bad, because the Bible's vocabulary, God's vocabulary for us to use when it comes to expressing ourselves, includes so much anger and frustration and even doubt. And so I just find comfort that even before we get to what is a biblical answer, what is God's answer to why COVID-19? I think first you have I don't know, I was chatting once with a neighbor back in Ottawa. I only moved to Toronto recently, and he was saying he hadn't prayed in years because whenever he prayed, he started coming out angry, and he thought, oh, I can't do that. But I was able to turn like Psalm 88, such a dark psalm, the darkest of psalms, and say, hey, look, it's totally okay to pray angry, to even say, not only to each other, but to even to God, like, God, why, if you're good, why COVID-19?
Right.
Daniel, before we get into like the actual response, do you have like, and since this is just a conversation amongst friends, do you have a favorite psalm that you like? Because like, and for people that are watching right now, Daniel, as he was alluding to in his, like at the beginning of the conversation, has worked on Parliament Hill in the midst of human trafficking, sexual exploitation, just really, I would categorize as like horrific things that go on in our modern, sophisticated societies. So I'm curious to know, Daniel, like, is there a psalm that you sort of cling to and run to as a refuge when you want to voice your lament?
Yeah, thanks, man. Well, for me, Psalm 88 is such a precious one because all the other psalms beautifully, and we keep using that word, but it's true and it's fair, beautifully have this one Hebrew letter. Actually, this morning, my wife and I are going through some really tough stuff, just really personally for us. And so this morning, we were just kind of sitting on the couch. I canceled a couple meetings. We're just grieving together about some stuff. And I said, you know what? My family's Jewish. And so I said, I think we need to just stop and have a Hebrew lesson, the two of us. And we just spent some time, just both of us, looking at the Hebrew word, which is one letter, Vav. And psalm after psalm of the 50 psalms, 49 of them, they start off with just the darkest of expressions of pain. And then it gets to this one letter, Vav, which means love. And then it talks about who God is, that anchor, that source of hope and comfort in the pain, a scarf God. And so Psalm, at the same time, as much as I love the letter Vav, which means but God, Psalm 88 is the only one that has no Vav in it. And I think that gives that takes off the pressure from us in our prayers of having to be able to make that turn toward hope. But Psalm 88 starts dark, is dark, and ends. The very last word of the psalm is darkness. And so that's very precious to me, in that it lets me be able to pray frustrated, angry, confused, doubting prayers to God, knowing that I can just say amen and walk away and not feel like I have to conjure up the strength to say something theologically beautiful.
Yeah.
I know that this is really relevant in your stories, though, that I think there's like atypical ways in which we think that we're supposed to interact and experience God. And I love what Daniel's saying, that there's actually this invitation to be honest and to be vulnerable, to be heartfelt and to be brutal in what we're experiencing in the moment, with the hope that we will experience God's goodness beyond that, but the freedom to speak really honestly in the moment. That our experience of faith is not exactly perfectly set in a set of steps that make perfect sense. I know that wasn't your journey exactly, Zoe, that everything was like perfect right off the bat the minute you said, Jesus, come into my life, I'm so good, and then bang, you were at Oxford figuring it out, right?
No, that wasn't my experience at all. I wish. No, actually, you know what? I don't wish that.
No.
That sort of suffering that I personally experienced was so formative for a number of different reasons. Driving out ego and humbling and learning to care and empathize and compassion, and to learn how to be more compassionate and stuff like that. So me personally, I wouldn't wish away any of the suffering that I've gone through in my life. Now, I'm just really fascinated about this whole lamentation idea, and I'm curious of what you guys think. But I'm going to get back to the question that you initially brought up. I'm not dodging it.
No, you're good.
It's just a conversation, right? So I was in Oxford. They had for the RZIM staff there, they have a on-call psychologist, and he's a brilliant guy. And when I was going through my time after Andrew had passed away, so again, it was this 2-long-year battle with cancer that started in the colon, metastasized to the liver, and then metastasized to his lungs. And I was there holding his hand as he passed away and went to be home with the Lord. When I was talking to him and expressing, like, what do I do with this grief? Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Should I try and, squash it? What? And he was saying this is fascinating. What your brain is always trying to do is your brain is always trying to heal itself. It's trying to bring it back to like this homeostasis. So he said, what your brain will do is it will bring back these thoughts or memories and experiences to the forefront of your mind. You get overwhelmed with these sorts of emotions so that you can process it, and then put it back into a more of a long-term memory storage unit versus your short-term. And as you do that, you're healing internally. So it brings up the emotions, you engage with it, and then you file it back away. And your brain knows how much you can handle at a time. So it'll do this in these sort of spurts. And so what he was saying to me is like, Alonzo, it's actually, the people that are really grieving and weeping and lamenting over whatever tragedy they're going through, or actually it's a very healthy sign, especially if it's done within community. This is a very healthy thing to do because it's showing that you're in this healing process. He said you should be worried about people that don't grieve because they are not processing the intense emotional charges that our bodies can create, that our minds can create, and that our hearts just cry out to experience. So I think it's just really interesting. So that's 21st century psychology.
Yeah.
How interesting is it that thousands and thousands of years ago, when the book of Psalms was first compiled, that God put this tool, this resource for us in order to experience a lot of healing. Yeah. I think that's like a part of the miraculous component of the book of Psalms. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Absolutely.
That beautiful conversation.
You answer the question, if God, why COVID-19?
Okay. Well, sorry.
But it's beautiful, Zoe. I 100% agree. That's like, it's such a spectacular story.
But the clock is ticking. Let's go.
Oh, sorry, guys. So I think when we're thinking about why evil, why suffering, we step back at first and just say, okay, we have a lot of hidden assumptions when it comes to the problem of evil, the classic trilemma. If God is all powerful and all good, he wouldn't allow suffering. But we see suffering, therefore there must not be a God. It was the logical problem of evil and suffering to show that God was incompatible of existing alongside evil and suffering. Because if God existed, he would stop it. He would either be all powerful and be able to stop it, and he's all loving, so he would want to stop it. But we see this evil, and therefore there must not be a God because he would have stopped. Does that make sense? So when you're thinking about this, there are lots of hidden assumptions that philosophers, especially in the past 50 to 100 years, have identified. So they think about it lots of times in possible worlds. Like what kind of worlds could God have created? Well, he could have created one of just a handful, it seems like. So main ones. So for instance, he could have created nothing. No one's putting a gun to God's head and saying you have to create something. Right. He chooses to, and for very specific reasons. And then another one is, well, he could have created, a world, but, maybe there's creatures, but just not humans. And so that's a possible world for God. Another possible world for God is God could have created a world where human beings only choose to do good. And lots of people are like, well, why doesn't God just do that? Why the fall that we read about in Genesis, where evil and sin and death enter the world? Why doesn't God just make us just so, in such a way that we only choose to do what he wants us to do? And that's a really good question, but there's a really big problem with that, because God is creating human beings with a specific purpose in mind. And this idea is the supreme ethic of love. Yeah. God wills and desires for free creatures to experience meaningfully and express meaningfully love. And you cannot have that in a world where creatures only choose to do good, because that world's not a real world of freedom. That's a world of robots and puppets. Yeah. So God chooses the fourth one out of those options, where he creates this world with human beings with free moral will, and that's where we can trace a lot of our suffering and evil and different things that we see in the world. Now, I think that's the beginning of an answer. I don't know if you want to jump in here, Daniel, I could keep going.
This is a really tough question. So for whichever one of your friends that sent it in, I'm so grateful for them. It's something that's I've struggled with so much. And I always, one that Alonzo and I chat a lot about when we were walking. Back in the day when we used to spend time together in real life, we've had a lot of chats about it. I crack with Alonzo some of the way that I understand the argument that if God was going to give us the freedom to, the ability to love, it must include the freedom to say yes to the laws of harmony and beauty and caring for people, or no. And so with that freedom we have to be able to care for others or not, there's real consequences for what we choose. And so at the same time, part of me wants to push back and be like, yeah, but if God is really all powerful, as the very nature of God would be, could he not have made, I kind of like the world where people only choose good. Robot. Could God not have been so powerful as to make it so that somehow that was still a world of freedom, even though we only chose good? I don't know if I'm fully satisfied with the answer. But Alonzo, I am satisfied with his courage to speak first. So, my man.
Well, let me just. Oh, sorry.
Oh yeah, but
I was just going to speak into that.
Please hit me back, bro.
Yeah. So I think that this brings up lots of other really important discussions. When we're thinking about it, well, why couldn't God have made something different? And it seems to me that there are lots of. It's more complex than we initially give it. He could just do this and then it would be fine. My first thought is this all-powerful, all-knowing being also deems that this is the best case scenario for human beings to thrive and to know him. So first of all, I think that my knee-jerk reaction is okay, even though I may not understand fully because I'm a finite human being, that I can trust that this omnipotent being probably knows better than I do when it comes to which possible world should I create. So that would be like my first, and the reason why I'm so confident in trusting God, and this is something that's taken a long time to think about, is I draw my trust on of God when I look at the person of Jesus Christ, because that is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. He is the express image of God. He is God enfleshed upon the earth. So if we want to see what God is like at his core, then we take a long look at who Jesus is. And so when we look at Jesus, what do we see? You know, he's on the scene, and as soon as we see him encounter disease, illness, demonic possession, and all sorts of different tragedies and evils and so on, the very first thing he does is he assaults them. He is not employing them to get some sort of greater benefit or teach someone a lesson or shaping them up a bit or anything like that. We see that God is ferociously trying to restore and redeem and heal a broken world. And that's the pinnacle of that is on Calvary's Hill. And so I draw my trust from this character of who Christ is, that he cares deeply enough to be nailed to a cross and come in the flesh and defeat the grave. So I think that's like a beginning of an answer, but that's a big topic.
So I so appreciate that, and I'm so with.
Yeah.
I think that, and I've heard you say before that like the question assumes, maybe even said it a few minutes ago, but the question, like, if God's good, or even more so, like, I can't believe in God because of the reality of suffering in the world. Like, it assumes that there can't be anything redemptive or beautiful or purposeful about the reality of suffering. One of the things I've heard, Alonzo, as we've wrestled through this, that Alonzo, you've shared with me before, is like if you were to, actually I think it comes from Viktor Frankl in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor and also one of the world's most influential psychologists, founded logotherapy. And he talks about how, like, if you were watching a film back in the days when it wasn't digital, but actual, like, images, if you were, like, freeze one image, you would not understand the purpose of that image. And similarly, even if you just saw one scene, like in Lord of the Rings, you see a scene and it's horrific suffering. But then when it's only, I've heard Alonzo use the term end of story narrative, that it's only once you get to the end of the story, you can look back and see how even the most painful of moments or the most bizarre one single frame actually is part of a beautiful story. And so the fact that we are finite beings, limited in our wisdom, limited in our insight, might not be able to see why God might allow suffering in the world, should make us conclude, therefore, there can't be anything redemptive about the suffering. Does that make sense? I find that, like, the Bible, again, wrestles and wrestles with this question. The book of Job is a great example of a story of a man who suffered profoundly, and he's wrestling all, and his friends are wrestling with him. Why? And he has this encounter with God at the very end of the book. And you'll note that the reader gets the behind-the-scenes perspective and can see something beautiful in God's allowing suffering. But Job never gets the behind-the-scenes picture. He never gets to see why he suffered. But ultimately, the book ends by God saying, "Hey, Job, look, you see my character. See, like, trust me." And I find that, I'm beginning to monologue, but
this is a really good point about Job. So, with our limited perspective comes a bunch of baggage and problems. So, for example, you know, our boss, Vince Vitale, he'll say all the time, you know, imagine you were to take a small one to the dentist, and it's in order to remove a cavity or something like that. There's this incomprehensibility on the young one's part to really know what's going on. All they see is that, hey, my dad or my mom is subjecting me to this sort of suffering. However, there is a very good reason, a very good, a morally sufficient good for that sort of experience to transpire. And so I think that sort of illustration just illustrates how our perspective is so finite versus, like, God's. And even, like, when you were talking about Job, Daniel, which I thought was brilliant, if Job knew not only what was going on behind the scenes, but how his life and how his suffering was to give courage and bravery and compassion to millions of people for the thousands of years after his life. One cannot help but think, would Job, if he was given the option to do it again, would he not have chosen it again? And I think the answer to that would be, yeah. Like if my life can benefit the millions of other people's lives afterwards, then yeah, I'm going to carry my cross, so to speak, and put up with it.
Yeah, I love the way you put that. I've never thought about that. Like, there's Job a few thousand years ago going through this time of wrestling through, and his wrestling actually has been the very words of comfort to people throughout centuries of time. Right. And it's a fantastic example, such an apt example of how our suffering can bring comfort to others. But at the same time, I think there's something beautiful about the fact that though throughout the Bible and throughout history and our own lives, we can see the way that dark times can help us be able to bring light and comfort to other people. Yeah. At the same time, the Bible is very clear that sickness, COVID-19, death, stuff is not good. Yeah. And then that's the kind of the thing for holding tension. Like, God can turn these dark things into about them, goodness through them, but they're not good. And so the Bible, like, it doesn't just leave us in that place where for all of time we're going to wrestle with these things, and it's just part of the human condition. But that God has promised to bring it to an end. All that darkness, He will crush it. He will vanquish it. And so COVID-19, cancer, death, this gets the word over any one of our lives.
Yeah. And I think too.
Sorry, Zoe.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, like, just on that point, that God, and this is a very important point, because the problem of evil and suffering, when it's exposed to a Christian, this is now an internal problem. So we get to, therefore, use all of the resources that are within the internal worldview. And sometimes I think that we often forget two things. What Daniel just said, the limited time that God has allowed evil and suffering to occur. That's important. That this isn't an eternal fate for our state. This is a finite sort of thing that God has allowed for a very short amount of time, and could have all sorts of different reasons for why He allows certain things, such as, one of us being born or something like that. And I also think that we forget about a word, forgive me for using a big word here, is eschatology. We need this revival of, our eschatology of that God has the resources to divinely compensate us after death. That death isn't the end for those who put their belief and trust in Christ. That God has the capacity to compensate us for those sorts of things, and that this sort of creation isn't the end all be all, but there's a new creation to come. So I think that those sorts of things are really important to think about as well.
Yeah,
and I think I love what you were saying, Daniel, with that sickness, the disease, that these are not of God. Like, God is not God is against those things that would hurt us, that would cause us pain, that would cause us suffering. God is not for those things, but God is able and He's willing to work all things that are around us for good. I remember I listened to you mentioned your boss Vince Vitale, and he was engaging with a question somewhat similar to this. I think someone was asking if God creates if all that God creates is good, why is there evil and suffering and pain in the world? And he gives I thought it was a great example of a buffet, that you walk into a buffet and you enjoy each of the individual items. And if it's like 100-piece Chinese buffet, man, there's so many good items there. But if you're like me, you go into the buffet and then you start experiencing that when you start mixing them all together, maybe they don't go together exactly as they were intended to go together. Yes, they were created individually with goodness in mind, and they can be a blessing, but how they are used and the manners in which they're mixed, that they create different scenarios that are different than what we kind of see God's intention at the beginning, that for all things to be worked for good. So Yeah, I love what you guys are saying about it.
Yeah, and even just trying to tie a few pieces together, a few of the things that we've mentioned so far, again, do find their unity or their purpose in the scars of Jesus. We mentioned it maybe like 40 minutes ago now, but about the about Jesus, about what God welcoming our doubt, and I think the most beautiful moment of that is when one of Jesus' close friends. It hurts so much more when our closest friends don't believe in us or doubt us. And after Jesus has died back to life, his friend Thomas hasn't seen it, everyone else has, and he just refused to believe in Jesus, he doubts him. And Jesus doesn't rebuke him in that doubt, but he welcomes him even closer, invites him to look at his wounds, his scars. And in that, so in the scars of Jesus, like we have eyewitness historical accounts that Jesus, this man who was crucified, killed, actually has come back to life, and the scars are evidence of that, the eyewitness accounts. And so that's where, for myself and my doubting whether or not this God is real, looking at those biographical, historical accounts, I find answers there. But then when I also look at this question of suffering, it's in the scars of Jesus, in his death, he has, if the Bible is to be believed, he's actually taking in himself not just a nail, but like the fullness of human despair and shame and guilt and brokenness and even sickness. And so and kind of had death die through his death and then beat it through his resurrection. And so ultimately, as we're wrestling with these questions, although the Bible gives us glimpses of how God might use darkness or allow darkness and be able to like bring redemption through tough times, ultimately Jesus doesn't give us a philosophical syllogism, like a trite philosophical answer to the problem of evil. Ultimately, he gave us a life. And the uniqueness of the scars of Jesus, Alonzo and I were on another live stream recently, and the wording that we ended up using was that, like, if the price or the value of something is found, you know what, someone will pay for it, then the value of every human being is found in the death of God. Like, infinite worth is the price that God paid redemption. And so even as we're left in this place right now of COVID-19 and social isolation and stir crazy and all the other pain we experience, we know with an objective truth, because of the scars of Jesus, that can be verified, that that every human being has value, that everyone's beautiful. Going back to the book, what's up? You can tell sometimes Alonzo and I, our main thing is monologuing, and so sometimes it's hard to actually have a conversation, right?
It's good. No, I appreciate it.
It was a good monologue. It was a good monologue, Ben.
So good, guys. So good. I appreciated your wisdom, your thoughts, your resources that you've kind of given us to even just to think and wrestle, and even just the invitation that you've kind of given myself and everyone who's watching to ask questions, to lament, to feel the tension of the moment and know that God meets us in that moment and wants to provide incredible grace and incredible love, incredible hope that we can find nowhere else but in the person of Jesus. And it provides in such a unique way for us to share with others and to receive for ourselves. And so I've appreciated your hearts, and let me say that your hearts have shone through. Hearts for people, hearts for Jesus, hearts for monologuing. But it's so good. It's so good. Let me just end us in a word of prayer. Do you guys have any final thoughts that have just been like resonating with you before we wrap up? Something to tie some of your thoughts together?
Can I just say one thing? And this is something I've been thinking about. I'm just writing an article right now. I think I heard it from somebody else. I probably did. I want to say John Lennox, but I'm not 100%. But if it was him, he illuminated the fact that at the tomb of Lazarus, when Mary and Martha come and approach Jesus, they both say the same question. There's this barrage of questions. And Jesus, this is something really interesting to notice, that Jesus does not just dismiss their questions, call them doubters, say, "Oh, ye of little faith," and all of these sorts of things that perhaps sometimes we think Jesus would say if we had really deep questions, because they're pretty blunt. They get right to the point. "Lord, if you were here, our brother would not have died, and you loved him. You wouldn't have died if you were here."
Yeah.
And Jesus does something extraordinary that I think I just want to leave your congregation with, or whoever's watching online, is that Jesus, for Martha, engages where she is at with a theological, very intellectual conversation. And with Mary, he simply collapses into the dust and weeps with her.
Yeah.
That is the Jesus that we're presenting to you. And death that's right there moves Jesus to salty tears. But ultimately, he points towards his own resurrection during that same episode, where the ultimate destroyer of hope, which is death, collides with Jesus on the cross.
Yeah.
And so Jesus becomes the great destroyer of that which destroys hope, which is death.
Yeah. Yeah.
I submit to you that Jesus to think about, who loves you, and that's why he came, was so that you can have a relationship with him. So I just wanted to leave that last thought. He's not intimidated by your questions, but welcomes them. He's not intimidated by your lamentations. He welcomes them.
It's brilliant. Daniel, could you close us in a word of prayer?
Sure. And Jason, thanks for welcoming Alonzo and I on here. And Alonzo, thanks for introducing me to Jason.
Thanks, guys.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you that you are not just some spiritual energy of an impersonal nature that's kind of outside of existence, that is hoping for us to somehow discover you and clean up our lives. But instead, you are the God who took on human flesh to reveal yourself to us and even die for us. And that you know exactly the pain of what we're going through, and it pains you too. And so for whoever's watching and listening to our conversations and monologues, God, thank you that they are precious to you, that they are not invisible, but that they are seen by you, that their pain and their tears are heard by you, and that they are held by you with nail-scarred hands. God, I pray that you would help each one of us, including Jason and Alonzo and myself, be able to both find comfort with you in the darkness that we're in right now, but also that you would, in your goodness and grace, lead us through the darkness into the light. And so, Father, I pray that your blessing, your light would shine upon us afresh, and that we might know you personally, you who are the most inspiring, comforting, most beautiful, stunning reality we can ever know. God, help us to know and be comforted by the fact that you are real and you really are worth all that we are. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Amazing. Thank you, gentlemen, for taking time today. I know I've been blessed by the conversation, and our community at City Collective is it's going to eat this up. I think there's lots of good things for us to wrestle on. But have an amazing rest of your day wherever you're watching this from. City Collective, we love you. If you need prayer right now, our team is so ready and willing to stand with you. One of the things that even Daniel was mentioning earlier was that the search term prayer has spiked on Google in this last little time. So know that if you're looking for someone just to talk to and just to support you in the season, pray at citycollective.com. Send an email there. Someone on our team will reach out, and that's just one of the ways that we get to be the church in a meaningful way in this season. But God bless. Love God. Love people. Like I said, be the church. We'll take care. Love you guys.
Thank you.